What you believe to be true, is it really true? Or have you just accepted it at face value because it's what you were taught and have never looked any further into it? There is a wealth of evidence backing the idea that giants were once a part of this world, found in photographs, mythological stories, religious records, archaeological finds, and architectural structures. Tonight's special guest will add a valuable piece to this portfolio of proof. Throughout history, our comprehension of the physical world has undergone numerous modifications. It's natural to disregard ideas that seem absurd with a casual gesture, but it's something altogether different to assess the objective world, free from any pre-established beliefs. Thousands of years ago, there were people who were much larger than the average human today. These giants had a significant influence on the cultures of the time. Legends describe them as powerful, wise, and sometimes even immortal. They were regarded as heroes, gods, and demigods, depending on the culture. Archaeological evidence of their existence can still be found all around the world, from the ruins of ancient temples and cities to the artifacts that have been unearthed. There are numerous stories of these giants in ancient texts and myths, and they were often seen as symbols of strength and power. In some cases, it is even believed that these giants may have been the source of some of the ancient civilization's most advanced technologies. There are also accounts of the giants interacting with humans, either as friends or enemies. As technology and science continue to advance, more evidence of the existence of these giants is being discovered. We can now look back at the past and more accurately assess the impact that these giants had on the cultures of the time. In many cases, it can be seen that the giants played a role in shaping the world that we know today, from the construction of monuments to the introduction of new technologies. There is even the possibility that these giants may have been the originators of modern-day ethnic customs. The idea of giant beings existing in the past may seem outlandish and absurd, but it is important to objectively evaluate the evidence that exists in its support.
You are listening to VERITAS. If this is your first time listening, welcome home. To listen to tonight's full interview and all of our material, join the VERITAS family and click on the subscribe button at veritasradio.com. Don't forget to visit the VERITAS store for focused life force energy. Get a 15-day free trial of FLFE today. We also have rebounders, pure organic sulfur, flash drives with all our VERITAS and Sanitas seasons, and other great products. And if you want to get in touch with Mel, want to be a guest on this radio program, have a guest suggestion, or have feedback, just click on the contact button of our website at veritasradio.com. And now, here's your host, Mel Hasselrick.
Mike Wilkerson has always had a knack for asking unconventional questions. As a teen computer hobbyist turned hacker in the early 80s, his thirst for knowledge led to wild adventures with some of the top hackers in the nation. But in 1985, the fun ended in a brief incarceration after being caught for his infiltration of computer servers at Microsoft and 3 other Seattle area companies. Though he has walked the straight and narrow since then, Mike's propensity towards questioning the unquestionables has never waned. In the decades that followed, he morphed from a mischievous hacker to a benevolent backcracker. For over a decade now, Mike has lived and worked as a chiropractor on the Costa Blanca in Spain, where his mission is to improve the health of the world one spine and mind at a time. Mike is a father of 2 and an avid hiker, health crusader, artist, budding author, and mapper of rabbit holes. He is also a purveyor of the nascent academic disciplines of Bio-Geology and Titanology. As a part-time independent researcher, Mike has focused primarily on alternative history, non-standard cosmologies, catastrophism, and rapid petrification. He considers himself a cross-disciplinary field researcher. His YouTube channel is Stellium7, Stellium 7. And directly from Costa Blanca, Alicante, Spain, I would like to welcome, for the first time on Veritas, Mike Wilkerson. Hello, Mike, and welcome. How are you?
Hi, Mel. I'm doing great. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
My pleasure. And by the way, I want to say thank you to all of you guests who come on this program. It's very late where you are and you're still up, but you told me that you still have a lot of energy. So I'm looking forward to this. So I don't need to remind our audience that we must open our minds to what we're going to discuss tonight, folks. And I say this because our education or indoctrination is what is responsible or for closing our minds. You have 2 degrees, Mike, and you are very familiar with the scientific method, and it's okay to be skeptical, but I would encourage that folks suspend your judgment and consider the possibilities. For those people who don't know who you are, I've already read your bio. You had a stint with law enforcement many years ago as a hacker. Can you give us that part of your story and then how you got into what you are doing now?
Yeah, briefly, as a young teen, I got into computers. It was the very beginning of personal computing, and telecommunications was all through the telephone, and you put your handset on a little acoustic coupler. Later on, you could plug it into the wall, but it wasn't very sophisticated like it is now. But I just had a love for technology and all the innovation that was taking place, and my curiosity got me into trouble because I was looking for all sorts of subversive information after a while, and wanted to understand the inner workings of how the telephone system worked and whatever else I could learn.
What year was this, Mike?
The year that I was caught was 1985, and the court case took about a year, and it ended in 86, and I was convicted of 4 counts of illegal computer trespass in the state of Washington. I was living in Kirkland at the time, close to Seattle, and there were 4 different companies that I was tried with for infiltrating, and that was Microsoft, a subsidiary of Boeing, Kenworth Trucking, and another called Resources Conservation Company. Sunstrand as well.
It's interesting you said 1985 because that's when I had my first computers, Commodore 64 and 128, and I used to contact so many BBS. You probably remember that, bulletin boards, and accessing all the conspiracies. And I was giving telephone numbers to call and try to get into certain things that I'm not going to discuss here because I don't want anybody to be looking at that. But that started me too. I never was, I didn't go through what you went through. But I remember downloading all this stuff at night with a modem that had to be connected to, you get the phone and put it on top of the modem. And I remember I had a dog at the time, and if the dog barked, the whole communication would break and all those things would break and I would have to call again. You probably remember those times.
Definitely. Yeah, it was fun. Similar to what I'm doing now, really. We were hacking the telephone system in different ways. There were all kinds of different techniques and devices that had been developed to be able to make free calls and conference calls. And so long before there were forums and the kinds of things that people are engaging with now, we were all staying up all night long as teens, talking to each other across the nation and sharing tips and different techniques for having fun. So.
Yeah, I remember friends calling each other worldwide because they would tap into the phone companies at night and would try to extract the passwords, but I'm not going to get into that right now. We're going to do a show in the future. You have a book that you're working on about your history and all the good things that you're doing now. Hackers from Heaven is one thing that's happening out there where they're tracking missing children. So you have transmuted that into good, and I'm so glad to hear. But tonight we're here for a different reason. For the past, I would say 2-3 years, I've been provided so much information, Mike, that when I look at things that before I didn't look at, for example, architecture. Before, I would say these are very ornate, very nice buildings, but they don't seem to fit in here. And that's one thing that everyone can recognize. But then you start looking at what now, when I go through the United States countryside and I see these big stumps, what they look like stumps, and then you see mountains, when you start looking at them in a different way, it's almost like somebody's sleeping there. and you see the eyes, you see the nose, you see the facial expression, but you have taken this to the next level. Tell me how you got into this research now.
Well, it was really a conglomeration of a whole bunch of different threads that I'd been looking at. One of them was just alternative cosmologies in general, and looking at how much of what we're told about the universe and where we live is accurate. And this ties into everything, because it ties into the age of the world that we're in. This ties into geology, all sorts of different subjects with regards. Sorry, lost my train of thought there. I'm a little nervous, to be honest. It was looking at geology, looking at something called mud fossils, which was a YouTube channel that I ran across, where the Roger Spurr was talking about the idea that petrification could happen a lot faster than we ever realized. And that was a new idea for me, because I'd studied different subjects in high school and again in college, and never really looked at the mountains and the rocks with new eyes, so to speak, because I was never particularly interested. I was always interested in the future. I was interested in what was coming, and I just thought we're at the pinnacle of evolution, and the world is everything's pointing towards the future. I was a big lover of sci-fi, Star Wars and Star Trek and all these kinds of shows as a kid. And so looking at the past, or looking at rocks or archaeology or any of these kinds of subjects, it was really just about the most boring thing that I could imagine. And so about 4 years ago, coming across the idea of mud fossils, watching another video by a channel called Wakey Wakey, where he was digging into different ways in which the narratives that had to do with geology, things like the different systems that were used for dating and determining how old things were, that maybe not all of that science was truly settled as we're taught, and that things might not be as old as we were taught, because they're often talking in timelines that have to do with hundreds of millions of years. Talk about the Earth being over 4 billion years old, and that they can see back to the beginning of time, and that the universe is 16 billion years old. All of these kinds of things I just took for granted as true, because I figured, we've been to the moon and we've been to space, and so it's moving forward, and we've got to figure out how to get off this rock before we get hit by a rock, that sort of thing. And so I have a very unusual best friend. His name is Alex Michael. He's also known as the conspiracy music guru.
Oh, he's a
Some
friend
know him
too.
as the,
Yeah.
So, some know him as the Flat Earth Man. Yeah. And so we've known each other now for about 5 years, and he was the one who first hit me with the idea that the Earth might not be what I was taught to believe it was. And so we had lots of debates going back and forth, and I tried to shoot down his ideas one by one, but he countered with a whole lot of very empirical, factual based information that had to do with different scientific experiments. And I was like, well, what about, our moon landings, and what about all the satellites floating around up there, and what about the ISS? And there's live streams from the ISS, and there's satellites floating in space that we use with our phones. And so I thought he was absolutely nuts. And up until he brought that up, I thought he was an incredibly intelligent guy, and we had been kind of checking off the different rabbit holes we'd been down one by one, and really connected well. And then he brought that up, and I thought, I need to really rethink this guy, because if he's willing to believe something that absurd, then he's willing to believe absolutely everything. And if you believe absolutely everything, then you believe nothing. And so it took a while before I actually went and tried to research things and debunk it. But now my conception of cosmology of the world is a lot different. I don't think we're on a flat disk that's floating out in space. I think it's something far more complex than that. I don't know what it is. I think we're in some kind of a realm, in a system, probably enclosed. And so when you start to ponder those kinds of ideas, and I'm a chiropractor by trade, and so being a chiropractor, I'm aware of the different ways in which the stories that we're told about our reality are not always matching reality, and there's a lot of funny business when it comes to what we're taught to believe. So, as you know well on this channel, you've been studying the funny business for over a decade. So.
By the way, there's nothing to be nervous about. I mean, you're talking to a friend, really, and we are very open-minded here. We discuss every topic, and I'm not here to debunk anyone. And, I watched all your videos, as I mentioned before we began this morning, and I appreciate your research. But let me just say in different words, what I said earlier on. For years now, Mike, I've been observing my surroundings with new eyes. Architecture, to me, is the most obvious, since it's man-made buildings that today's architects claim they can't replicate due to lack of funding. Artisans are not around to do it. They say that it's out of style, but yet they were erected in a time with a fraction of our economic prowess. Equipment, or so-called technological advances, we didn't have any of that. Horse and buggies. I say so-called because when you compare these old buildings, built with material that hardened with time, unlike today's, they were so ornate and incredibly pleasing to the eye. We know something changed, but there's another part of this spectrum into all these unknowns that once you start paying attention, you can't ignore. And I'm referring again to what seems to be petrified trees, petrified animals. And yes, the one aspect the Smithsonian and history books do not mention. And if they do it in the form of legends. I'm referring to giants or titans. It literally challenges the very foundations of geology, Mike.
Yeah, it turns it on its head. And it doesn't mean that there isn't a lot of truth in geology. And obviously, there's all kinds of different experimentation that's done and instruments that can be used to look at things in different ways. So, it's not that you would throw all of that out if the kinds of things that I've been talking about are true, or other channels that have done investigations into things like you mentioned, the giant trees, or just this idea of rapid petrification, instant petrification, mud fossils. These are all very fascinating ideas, but all of them would require a complete rewrite of many of the ologies, because as soon as you start to tug at the threads of one of the ologies, it overlaps and dovetails with other disciplines. So you've got to start to examine those as well. It's a very exciting time because there's so much that's being uncovered and rediscovered, and things that we thought and that were truths and took for granted we're finding out are not necessarily true at all.
By the way, Roger Spur was in this program not too long ago, maybe a year or two, I believe. But he did tell me, and I'll say this on the air, he did tell me before we began, I wanted only to discuss mudflood, but he said, please do not ask me about flat Earth. I don't go there. I don't believe in it. And I respect his decision and his position. I discuss both parts. I discuss the globe and I discuss the flat Earth. I mean, it's up to the listeners. I am a journalist. I get out of the way. And I've posted pictures here. I have a home in Mexico on the beach there. And I posted pictures of a landmass 89 miles away that I can see perfectly clear in the afternoons, only in the afternoons. And I've talked to captains and boats, and I say, can you look over there? Can you tell me what that is? And, that's Baja California. And I say, well, how many miles away? Well, that's about 90 miles away from here. How is it possible that we can see from top to bottom? And it's always the deer in the headlights stare. It's like, why are you asking me this? Are you saying that the Earth is flat? No, I'm not saying anything. I'm just saying science says that there's a formula that tells you that anything that goes beyond the horizon should fall X number of feet. And we can perfectly see from top to bottom. We can even see lights at night. Why? And the same thing has happened in Spain, in Michigan, I believe. They can see the Chicago skyline. So these are questions that people don't answer. And what does a meteorologist say? Oh, that's a mirage. You probably heard that before.
Yeah, absolutely. We're taught boats go over the horizon in school, and that's easily proven false nowadays by modern cameras because the zooms are so powerful that you can zoom out so far that you can't even see objects on the horizon, and then zoom in and see a boat, and not just see part of the boat, but see the bottom of the boat, see the wake of the boat from distances. And you mentioned Baja California. There's actually a video that I saw by a channel called J. Tolan Media. And this man is a very, very high level scientist. I think he works in the military industrial complex. And he's like, he got onto the flat earth subject and he's like, well, I'm going to test it, and he's got these incredibly high power lenses. And he went up into an airplane with infrared technology. And infrared cuts through the atmospheric occlusion. So you see incredibly far. And what you see is what's heated up by the sunlight. So it's, it's amazing. Well, he was flying over Texas and pointing the camera towards Baja.
Yep.
And he could see the entire length of Baja. He could see the water between Texas and Baja, and the water behind, and the horizon far beyond that. Well, he was looking at, and this is calculating for his altitude, obviously, but he was looking at over a distance of 500 miles. And at that distance and his viewing altitude, I believe that there should have been about 56,000 feet that should have been obscured behind the curve. So that would be like stacking two Mount Everests on top of each other and only seeing the tip of the second Everest. And that's just completely impossible on a ball the size they tell us. And that's one of the shorter observations that he's made. He's made observations looking from basically the same location, like over Texas, all the way across to the far end of the Hudson Bay, which is probably around between 1,000 and 1,200 miles. So those are the kinds of things that cause me to go, what? And then also being here in Spain, off the coast is the island of Ibiza from me, which is 90 kilometers in distance. And one of my absolute favorite subjects in high school was geology. Geometry. Geometry. Calculating curvature and angles and all these kinds of things. I absolutely loved that as a kid in school. And so I just got busy and started doing the math and realized that there was about 200 meters of that island that should be missing at that distance. And I took a picture with my phone on the day that I was looking at this. It was a winter's day, very clear air, and I could see the entire island. So yeah, and that also opens up the door for the possibility that maybe this realm is a lot bigger than we realize. And if it's bigger, then that means that, well, first of all, much of what we've been taught about our reality is a lie. Second of all, the mythology may very well be our real past, our real history.
Absolutely. And I recently found out that when they were making the movie King Kong in the 1970s, the producers wanted a real-size animatronic Kong. But the problem was that it was so large that the metal support system, almost like a spinal cord, the whole skeletal part, metal, collapsed due to its weight. So this begs the question, if these large living beings existed, these titans, these giants, did our environment change? Atmospheric pressure, levels of oxygen, nitrogen, gravity. Let's unveil the titans as we have discovered, Mike.
Yeah, absolutely. They couldn't, in the model we're given, they couldn't have existed. And I hear that all the time from people on the channel. They're talking about, I can't remember what it's called, the inverse square law. That's for light. It's something that has to do with the size of something eventually reaching a size where it couldn't possibly support its own weight because it would crush under the pull of gravity. And I think that if the world is very different from what we think, then it's very likely that we had a much greater atmospheric pressure, because it's been shown with scientific experiments that you can create gigantism in like fruits and vegetables and plants if you put them in a pressurized room and you increase the oxygen content. So, I mean, we already know in the fossil record that things were much, much larger in the past. That's even in the mainstream narrative. So, how big were things? That's the question.
Now, you don't have an elephant in the room, but you have a possible elephant that you can see from your backyard, and it's the Montgo Mountain. When did you realize that maybe it was a petrified elephant?
Well, after seeing some videos by Roger, another guy named Alan from a channel that no longer exists called Flat Earth Nation, he's now got one called Mud Flood Was Armageddon. Those guys, they kind of got me looking at rocks differently. And then Roger was on about this giant dragon in the Sahara Desert that he was talking about regularly. And what fascinated me was not just the detail of the anatomy that he was showing, but also that there was actual records, or not records, but discussion of a great battle between the Leviathan and the Behemoth that occurred in that part of the world, that was written about by, I always say Plato. I think it was Platonius or something. I can't remember the name of the writer. I've never read the text myself, but there's a lot of other texts, like in the Bible itself. They talk about the giants. The Titans are mentioned in the apocryphal texts, like the Book of Enoch and the Book of Jasher. And in fact, the Book of Enoch even gives a measurement. It describes it as being 3,000 ells. And if you calculate that in the current measurements, that would be roughly a mile high. And that's about the size of Montgo. It's 753 meters at its highest point, which would be the top of the head, and it's about 3 miles in length. This is very small compared to what Roger was talking about. And when I saw his videos on the dragon, I was like, well, okay, it's kind of interesting, and I think it's interesting that they talked about it in some of the myths in the old texts. But I wasn't considering Montgo at all. It wasn't until I saw a video by Daydreamers where he started to tie some of these different threads together, and I'd been looking at this mountain for a long time because it looks very much like an elephant. It's got a head. It's even got an eye socket right exactly where the cave should be, and I'd been up at that cave many times, and it's a very unusual cave. So I thought, no, it couldn't be it couldn't be true that was once an elephant. It's a silly idea. So the first thing I did is I got on Google Earth, because I knew that on Google Earth I could tilt it in 3D mode, and I could kind of do like an aerial view and look at this thing in more detail. I'd hiked to the top of it probably 10 different times by that point, and many times to the eye. I'm an avid hiker, and I love it. And I've always walked around this mountain thinking, these stones are so bizarre. How did these form? Because I knew the basics of what they tell us about what they call petrogenesis, which is how the rocks are formed. And they tell us that there are basically 3 different kinds of rock. You have igneous, metamorphic, and sedimentary. And igneous would be your lava rock. You can actually witness that being created. It comes out of the volcano. So that's not a myth. It's not a theory. You can actually watch it happening. And then metamorphic, well, I'll mention sedimentary first and then go to metamorphic. But sedimentary stone are all these layers that they used when they're finding fossils and when they're talking about the dating. And those layers are laid down, we're told, over millions of years of time as different plant and animal life die and then are compressed under the sea floor. And then eventually that hardens, and the harder it gets and the further down it gets and the hotter it gets, that can start to morph into what they call metamorphic stone, which is a blend of lots of different things. So those 3 different types of stone are how they explain everything in geology. And so then tectonic activity will cause plates to collide, and that creates the mountains, and then the mountains break off into smaller and smaller pieces, and then those roll around and erode as a result of water and wind and mineral erosion. So that's the basic story of petrogenesis, how all the different stones are formed, and it obviously gets incredibly complex from that point because there's hundreds and hundreds of different kinds of minerals and stones. But there's a bunch of them here that just baffled me because it made no sense that there were channels going through them. It looked like a block of Swiss cheese. But not just holes going in, the holes had holes, and those were going in different directions. So I'm looking at it thinking, if this is caused by water erosion, is the water like making a 90-degree turn and eroding off to the sides of this channel? Why would this happen in this way? It just didn't make sense to me, and it didn't. The penny on that didn't drop until much later. But the first thing I started doing with the mountain, because I took a step back from it. I mean, it might sound like I'm a total wacko. I'm talking about flat Earth. I'm talking about, titans and whatnot. But I do come from an academic background. I have a bachelor's in the classics, basically, Italian cultural studies. I studied abroad in Italy. That was how I originally ended up in Europe. And I've been in Europe since '97. And so I've done a lot of studying over the years. Then I went on to study chiropractic. That was another 5 years of college. And for my master's in chiropractic, I did a massive research project that involved a 50-page research paper with 5 pages of resources for this paper. So I'm familiar with the scientific method. I'm familiar with how you go about conducting proper research. And so that was what I said. I took a step back and I said, if I'm going to look into this, I'm going to go any further. I'm going to eliminate things like pareidolia right off the bat, which is when you look at something that looks like something and you think it's something. Like if you're looking at a cloud or you look at a tree and you see a face, and that's I was well aware of that long before I got in this. That pareidolia is a real thing, and people can see things and think that they are something that they're not. And then there's another concept called apophenia, which is similar to pareidolia, except it has to do with pattern recognition, where you think that you're seeing a reoccurring pattern, but there's actually no connection between the things that you think are connected. And so in order to not fall victim to pareidolia and apophenia, I decided to create a laundry list of different things that I would expect to find if there was any truth to it. But before I did that, I was looking at the mountain on Google Earth and looking at it from lots of different angles. And after about an hour or two, that first evening of looking at it, I'd already found about 10 different macro anatomical features. There was the head was shaped properly. There were cutouts on both sides where the head would meet the shoulder, the neck. The eye was placed properly. There was a deep crevice between where the legs would be. I could make out the faint remains of ribs and the spinal. The spine was clearly there, running along the length of the mountain. So already that was 10. And I've played a lot of backgammon in my life. I love games. I love looking at the odds of things happening. And already the odds were like, wow, that's bizarre, because if it's pareidolia, sure, you can see it from a particular angle. The shadows can fall just right, and you can fool yourself into believing it's a face of a giant person or a creature. But if you're gonna start making claims about something, you better have a preponderance of evidence in place before you come out with it. Otherwise, people are going to think you're nuts. So, the next thing I did is got out the anatomy books. I started looking online at 3D anatomy and looking at skulls, because I remembered from my studies that even though skulls change dramatically from creature to creature, the basic makeup of them is the same. The different bones that go into creating a skull, and specifically the eye socket, is made up of 7 different bones that all meet in these lines forming the eye cavity, and those lines are known as sutures. And so I had this list of different things that I would expect to find if there was anything to it. And I took that list with me, and I went up, and the second video that I made was all about the eye of Montgo and the different findings that I discovered that day. And a lot more findings came after that.
I'm going to get back to Montgo in a moment, but you mentioned a YouTube channel, Mudflood Was Armageddon. I haven't checked it out yet, but just that name, Mudflood Was Armageddon. We have the technology, and again, you don't have to believe anything we're saying here tonight, folks. You can do your own research. This is just merely my opinion, but I believe we have the technology to manipulate the weather, to create droughts, to create hurricanes, storms, steer those hurricanes, create earthquakes, and I wouldn't be surprised if we could trigger volcanoes. And if you can trigger volcanoes, do you think that a lot of these mud floods that we've had in the past, maybe not so distant? Because after watching your videos, I see this individual talking about Mount St. Helens in 1980, and he mentioned that this side of the mountain was petrified not in a million years, not in 1,000, not in 100 days, months or days, in 3 hours. So imagine what kind of force could do that.
Yeah, and also that clip that you're referring to, it's in the Petrified Titans and Organs Part 2 video, I believe that I have. It might be Part 1, but I think it's Part 2. That, the other way around, Part 1. That geologist, he really kind of shook some of the foundations of geology with his research, because there were slurry flows from that eruption that caused, the lahars, the volcanic ash mixed with water because of the snow that was on the mountain at the time that erupted. All of that just created this massive flow, and within just a few hours, it formed these sedimentary, quote unquote, sedimentary layers. We would call them sedimentary layers, with micro layering that would normally take thousands of years to form based on the mainstream narrative. So that gets into this question of like, well, if you're looking at fossils and you're looking at different layers, whether it's the Cambrian or the Pleistocene or whatever the layer is, and you're determining the age of something based on the layer, how can you really know that that's what's happening? It's kind of circular reasoning, because they look at the fossils and they know the age of the fossils, but then the age is tied to the layer that it's in. So yeah, Mount St. Helens was very interesting, but volcanoes in and of themselves are a very fascinating subject, and there's a lot of alternative researchers who two in particular that I know that are leaning towards the idea that volcanoes themselves might be ancient technologies. So there might be something massive that's buried below the ground, and periodically it raises its ugly head. Volcanoes are fascinating. Volcano lava tubes are bizarre. It's hard to imagine how they form. Yeah, I have a lot more questions than I do have answers. And I, from my very first video, I made it clear to people, look, I'm not an expert in any of this stuff. I'm not a geologist. I'm not an anthropologist. I'm more of a selective sifter, a dot connector. I take a syncretic approach to things, and I've always been fascinated in where the overlaps are. And when it comes to so many of these different subjects, which to somebody who's entrenched in mainstream thought, each one of these in and of itself sounds absurd and crazy when they're contemplating them, and all of them together is absolutely nuts. But what's odd is how well so many of these things dovetail. They might be envisioning some crazed conspiracy theorist with a corkboard and pins and lines going in different directions and red circles and gesticulating wildly. That's not how it is at all. There's so much stuff that lines up. And you were talking about mud floods and the architecture. There's the phenomenon of star forts. I have a close friend who's mapped over 10,000 of these things all over the world on every continent. And the size of them is off the charts. And so when you start looking at the narratives of when those things were supposedly built, how long it took to build them, who built them, that's when it starts to get bizarre. And if you've gone into, you had Jay Widener and you had Michelle Gibson on very, very recently, and both of them are looking into all of these things that you were talking about. And Michelle Gibson, I'm not familiar with her research directly, but I've seen little bits and pieces here and there, and she does some very in-depth study. And she's talking about grid lines and these different things about the actual structure of the realm that we're in. And there's a lot of evidence out there to show that this place isn't what we were taught at all.
Michelle is doing an excellent job. She's a pure soul. She has no agenda other than getting to the truth, just like you and I. The same thing, our approach. I mean, this is why my favorite quote is, would rather have questions that can't be answered than answers that can't be questioned. And, thinking of this geologist on your video from 1980, I'm just thinking that, was he admonished after he came out with that? He's speculating that. And science is supposed to be questioned. But today's science, Mike, to me, it's the religion that must not be questioned.
Yeah, well, it's dogma. It's scientism, and so many people are actually engaging in scientism and have no idea, because what they're really doing is it's all appeal to authority, and they might be an expert themselves in some field, but they recognize that I'm an expert in this field, but I know nothing about that field, and so I'm not in a place to make any judgments or to draw any conclusions, because that's not my area of expertise, and I disagree with that thinking, because I think that an expert in one thing has a rational mind and is capable of understanding, logical fallacies and whether a logical reasoning makes sense, or whether, a line of reasoning makes sense logically. And so that's, that, what was I lost the main point I was making there. We'll come back to it.
That's okay. I'll ask you another question. I'll come back. I understand it's late over there. Now, one new thing I've discovered from your...
an hour past my bedtime.
I know. From your research, it's obviously the mud fossil hearts. You illustrate this very well in your videos. And you've found many of these, and you point to the overall morphology, the pericardium, the valve structures, and everything else. These petrified hearts, are they petrified inside too? Would you expect to find soft tissue or cellular structure in a petrified heart, Mike?
I've broken many open, and I've sliced into a number of them, and I've polished them, and no, there's no soft tissue. So I wouldn't expect to be able to extract DNA, from them, because whatever turned them from flesh to stone has likely denatured the proteins of the DNA. So it's possible that I might be able to someday, get a sample. Roger Spur has done it, or so he claims. He has 3 different lab reports from a supposedly reputable laboratory that are from these stone samples that show that it was humanoid DNA. We mentioned mud flood was Armageddon before. I just want to add that people know Roger, and they know him because he's been around for a long time. They know him as the originator of this idea of mud fossils. And because he's got a larger channel and he has those lab reports, he's got quite a big following. Alan from Flat Earth Nation, Mud Flood was Armageddon now, his channel was taken down at one point. He had about 10 or 12,000 subs, but he's been in it just as long as Roger has, and has taken a very different approach to it, and so I think it's good to know that it's not just Roger that was on the subject, and many people in the past, including all the ancients, the mythologies, the indigenous peoples talk about the rocks were once alive. You've got this idea of the transformer stones, which are these beings that can turn to stone and then turn back to living creatures. So there's a lot of interesting stuff out there that most people would just write off as superstition, and it may not be. May not be.
What kind of? Before I ask you this question, you and I think we're the same age. And growing up, I bet you use a magnifying glass to burn paper and do some other stuff, right? I recently saw somebody putting a large magnifying glass and basically melting stone. So if you were the cultural editors or the elite and you wanted to get rid of an entire city, would they have the technology to put, let's say, a big magnifying glass over that city and essentially basically melting them away? I wouldn't discount those possibilities. But what kind of force would be required to transmute biological tissue to stone or melt stone?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I was just thinking when you said that, I thought of the firmament. So if there is some kind of a curved enclosure, then there's your lensing right there, or at least a potential lensing. Magnifying glass I think they can freeze things very quickly as well. So it works both ways, not just with heat. The magnifying glass turning things, just literally melting stone, and it's a fascinating idea. There's this idea of instant petrification is not a crackpot idea. There's lots of examples of things in the geological record that are petrified that by all intents and purposes shouldn't be, based on what we've been taught. Like soft tissue, for example, these heart stones that I'm finding, that shouldn't exist in mainstream geology. And it was real puzzling for me, because why would I find these things outside of the body? We can get to that later. But there's a guy named Girolamo Sagato who knew how to petrify flesh in Italy in the 1800s. His secret died with him. There was another guy named Bruni. There are museums that house their works to this day. There's lots of examples, like, for example, Mother Shipton's Cave in the UK has very high mineral content waters that can lead to rapid petrification. People go and bring little trinkets and hang them from ropes, and then the water drips down the ropes and surrounds these things and encases them in crystal, and then eventually turns them to stone. There's a lake called Lake Natron. I'm not sure where it is. I think it's near the Black Sea, if I recall. But that lake has such high mineral content waters that something similar happens. You've got the mud fossil idea, where things are encased in mud. And that's basically, if you took a hunk of flesh and you surrounded it in mud, it wouldn't decay. And the reason is that the larvae and the bacteria that would normally eat away at the flesh can't thrive in that kind of an environment. So the lump of flesh would just sit there for a very, very long time. And eventually all of the water and the gas that's inside of the flesh would work its way out, and the minerals that are in the surrounding mud would work their way in. That process is called paramineralization, and that is the mainstream explanation for how we get things like the petrified trees, through paramineralization. It's that exchange of the materials. But in the mainstream, they're telling us that it happens over hundreds of millions of years of time. In Roger's model, it happens anywhere from 6 months to a couple of years. It all depends on the conditions, and it's going to be, the results are going to be different every time in every situation, because it depends on what you're starting with as a material that's going to be hardened, and what the surrounding substrate is that material finds itself in. So you've got the mud fossil idea, which I was initially fond of. It didn't make any sense to me when it came to the mountain, though, because I couldn't imagine how the ground could rise up 800 meters to cover this mountain and stay there long enough for it to turn to stone. So pretty early on, I was already drawing the conclusion that mud fossil theory wasn't sufficient to explain the things that I was finding, and especially so when I got to the heart stones, because it didn't make any sense at all. I could understand it if you were finding petrified bodies or portions of bodies and maybe a heart contained within that, but to find organs by themselves, I couldn't understand it. But the initial The reason I got on the subject initially is because I was so frustrated with what I was seeing in the mud fossil community, because there were so many people showing rocks, and they were making these grand claims about what that rock was, and they were 100% certain that it was a this or it was a that. And there were other than Roger's 3 tests, there was no real testing that was being done, and a lot of people were looking at pictures of mountains and doing the same thing. So that ties into pareidolia. Just because something looks like something doesn't mean it is, but sometimes things are what they appear to be. And that was what I, when I found this first heart stone, I immediately recognized it as a heart, and I recognized that there were, from just a few minutes of looking, I spotted 8 or 9 different anatomical features that were consistent with a heart. And as I got the rock back and I started looking through the anatomy books and refreshing myself on the real minutia of heart anatomy, that was when I started finding more and more. And that shouldn't happen. That goes back to the odds thing that I was talking about before. You roll the dice and you roll double sixes. Well, that's 1 in 36 odds. Okay, but if you roll double sixes twice in a row, it's just gotten way bigger, the odds of you doing that. So the odds of finding a stone that has 15 or 20 or 25 different anatomical features that match up with, anatomy is it shouldn't be possible unless that thing actually is what you think it might be. So that was what happened with this stone. And I remembered the point I lost before when I lost my train of thought. I was talking about experts being able to discern whether another expert actually makes sense, even though it's not their field. And it's sometimes said that being an expert is knowing more and more about less and less until you know absolutely everything about nothing. And I think there's some truth to that, because people get very myopic in their vision, and they don't look beyond their little area of expertise. And there's such a compartmentalization in academia that you get all these people that it's the classic, looking at the elephant. Somebody's holding the leg and thinking it's a tree trunk, and somebody's got the tail, thinks it's a rope, and somebody's got so we have to be a lot more disciplined and in our approach to looking at these things before we make claims about it.
Quick parenthesis. Quick parenthesis. Since I was talking about the big magnifying glass, an idea just came to mind. Just like a magnifying glass can burn things, I wonder if you used a magnifying glass during a full moon night and measure the temperature on the other side of the magnifying glass, if a thermometer would register colder temperature. Just thought about that. But to give a scientific perspective.
Oh, can I add something? Because that's such an interesting subject, because there's a lot of research that's been done into the moon actually having a cooling light, which makes no sense in the mainstream model. We're told that the sunlight is reflecting off of the moon and then it's coming to us. And if you start to look into the inverse square law of light, that makes no sense because of the distance of the moon and the distance of the moon to the sun. 93 million miles of light traveling, bouncing off the gray, dusty rock that is the moon, and coming all the way back. And on a full moon, you can read a book by moonlight on a clear night. It's kind of astonishing, really. Well, you would expect that if there was any radiation coming from that light that's coming from the sun, it would be incredibly minute, but maybe there would be some, magical way to measure that. But it doesn't radiate. It's not warm at all. It's actually the opposite. It's cooling. And you can prove this by going out on a full moon night with a thermometer that's accurate to a tenth of a degree. There can be measurement differences between moonlight and moon shade. Yeah. I've seen as much as 8 to 10 to 12 degrees difference, where it's cooler in the moonlight, and it should be the opposite. So there's a channel called Theory Apophysis. Ken Wheeler, he's a real master when it comes to things like optics and magnetics and different things. And he took a FLIR camera, which is an infrared camera, a military grade high level technology, and he took it out into his yard on a full moon night. I know this camera personally because a company that I co-founded in Sweden years ago, a tech company, we had this camera built into the software that we had created. So it was a measurement technique for chiropractic, for manual therapists. You could actually use infrared photography to look at the body and see how the body is radiating. And you can actually spot people's pain before they tell you where the pain is, because it's radiating more because of the increased metabolic activity. So I was already really familiar with that camera. And this guy, Ken Wheeler, took this thing out, and you could see, it's accurate to a tenth of a degree. And you can see, because of the quality of the resolution of this camera, you can see the whole yard at the same time. And it's like a fine line between moonlight and moonshade, and the moonlight is absolutely cooler, and that should not be the case. So that's just another, one of those things that we need to look into more and try to understand better. The ancients said that the moonlight was putrefying, so maybe it's absorbing radiant heat, and the sun is giving it.
That's what Sophia Smallstorm, one of our guests, said many years ago. She said that at night, when you don't have UV rays, that's when the cooling effect of the moon, if you have a dead carcass, that's when it putrefies even more during moonlight. But to give a scientific perspective, what happens to flesh when an organism dies? It's consumed by microbes and larvae, but what happens to the same flesh when it's encased in mud in an anaerobic environment?
Yeah, eventually it'll turn to stone, and depending on how long it's been there, will determine how hard the stone is, probably. But that gets back to what I was talking about, these different ways in which petrification can occur. So you've got the mud fossil theory, you've got this high mineral content waters, you've also got the concept of melting. You're talking about that with the magnifying glass. Well, we have with volcanoes, in the mainstream model of volcanoes, they talk about pyroclastic flows. This is the eruption of the volcano, and that the temperatures of those can reach as much as 1,500 degrees Celsius and can travel at the speed of sound. So that strikes me as the kind of thing that could not just annihilate something, but potentially turn it to stone. So when I was finding these heart stones all over the place, I was so puzzled, because why would the organs be found outside of the body? A lot of people ask me the question, like, was there some kind of a great ritual where they remove lots of organs and then somehow turn them to stone? And I said, no, that's definitely not the case, because what I'm finding is across all scale. I find them from millimeters up to, I found them as big as a meter in size, and exhibiting the exact same anatomical features that I've laid out in so many of my videos. And so, I couldn't explain why I was finding them. All I could do was show that I was finding them, that it was an actual phenomenon that wasn't being addressed by mainstream geology, that was very much repeatable, scalable. These are the things you're looking for when you're trying to engage in the scientific method. You make an observation, you recognize a pattern, and then you start to see if does this pattern repeat itself? What are the rules governing this pattern? And so that was how I approached it. And I went out live in the field in one of the early videos that I did on the subject, and I found a whole bunch of them. And I started to recognize more and more that these features were reoccurring. And all hearts are different. All species have slightly different shapes to their hearts. Like an elephant's heart is big and like a big blob, and a giraffe's heart is long and narrow. But they all have the same identifying characteristics, because they have these large blood vessels, the aorta and the vena cava, which go in from the top. They've got certain curves, they have certain lines, they have twists, and I was finding all of that over and over again in the stones. So that forced me to try and theorize, why is this happening? And I just theorized early on that the outer portion of the body has to be destroyed in some fashion. And as that destruction is taking place, I theorized that the organs themselves were hardening like stone. And the reason I believe that they were doing that is because all of the organs of the body are surrounded in a thick fascial sac. So that sac in the heart is the thickest of all of the organs, and it's called the pericardium. And so my theory was that and I think it has to do with either volcanoes or some kind of a plasma event. There's a lot of people talking about the plasma apocalypse. If you want to look at it from a biblical perspective, you'd be talking about the glittering sword of God. If you want to talk about myth, you might be talking about something like Medusa, because what did Medusa or what did Perseus do? He cut off Medusa's head, and he used that to turn the Kraken to stone. What was the Kraken? A Titan. So here he is using an ancient technology, which is Medusa's head, to turn this giant the size of a mountain to stone. So it's fascinating that there's, we have Cthulhu, we have Medusa, there are all these Hollywood movies. It's almost always the exact same kinds of things that are happening over and over again when it comes to the worldwide destruction. It seems to involve plasma, and any kind of changes in major changes in the earth are going to result in probably a whole lot of volcanic activity and, who knows what else. So, so those are the different ideas. But the theory that I came up with was boiled egg theory. And if you think about boiling an egg, you start with a little thin shell, and if you crack that shell open in the beginning, it's all liquid inside, right? But you put it in boiling water for 6 minutes, and you got a hard-boiled egg. You put it in for 12 minutes, and you probably don't even want to eat the egg anymore. Now, what if you take that and you put it in a pressure cooker? Because with a pressure cooker, you've got pressure and you've got heat. Well, a pressure cooker allows us to cook things way, way faster, right? You put in brown rice, normally takes 35 minutes. You can do it in something like 12 minutes in a pressure cooker. So If you have a mud flood, there's your pressure. The body's in the, but that wouldn't explain why the outer portions of the body would be destroyed. So that's why I leaned more towards something volcanic or something related to high level electrical activity. We have these things called Lichtenberg figures. If you look at the Grand Canyon and you look at a lot of the different scars that are on the earth, you've got this fractal-like, tree-like or lung-like pattern,
like roots or rivers.
Yeah, like a root structure, exactly. And that can be formed by high-level electricity. In fact, you can find videos online of people making these beautiful dining room tables where they put an electrode at one end and an electrode at the other, and they run a bunch of current through it, and it creates that exact same pattern. And the longer you run the current, the darker and the more burned and the more pronounced that pattern becomes. And when you look, I've spent a lot of time looking on Google Earth over the last years, and when you look from above, you see that kind of thing appearing over and over and over again. So I'm far more of the mindset now that it was some kind of a major plasma or electrical apocalyptic kind of an event. And whether this was antediluvian, probably, because the Titans were I don't know. It's there's so many got threads going in every direction here, but
no, that's okay. I get it. I mean, this is one of those rabbit holes that opens one door and then 10 open behind. But when I started looking into your research about hearts, the first thing that came to mind, but was easily discounted later, is the sacrifice. You've heard about, Apocalypto, the movie, and the Mayan civilization engaged in human sacrifice and extracting the heart. But I'm thinking that can't be possible because the heart probably would decay rather quickly. But these are thousands and thousands of rocks that are all over the world that look like a heart. The question is, have you found kidneys? And I think you have, because I've seen the videos. Any other organs that are easily identifiable?
Yeah, livers, hearts, kidneys. I don't find lungs. I think lungs are destroyed in the process because they're so porous. They're designed to fill with air.
Yes.
So I think they just melt away. And I don't find brains. I found one half hemisphere of a brain, and it's interesting because in my theory, there are a number of different tissues that I believe petrify to quartz. So fat. Disc, like in the vertebral discs, ligament, tendon, brain is almost entirely fat. I believe that all of the fat in the body, it actually turns to quartz in different ways. But quartz, if the temperatures reach, I think it's 2,000 degrees, that it will melt. So you actually can have a flow of quartz. It's still crystalline, but it's no longer looking like what most people would think of as a quartz crystal. So the pericardium is this outer sac to the heart, and I believe that is protecting the heart as it's hardening. And then the question is, well, what about the bones? Because the bones are already hard. That was another puzzling thing that took me a long time to figure out, how that could potentially be the case. Because like the bones are gone. Not all bones, obviously. They find fossilized bones all over the world, but in relationship to these hearts, there's no bones to be found anywhere. And I understood that if the outer portion is being destroyed of the body to the point where the hearts are turning to stone, then the long bones of the body, the arms, the legs, those must just disintegrate in some way, but I didn't understand how. And it was a friend of mine who brought up the concept of making bone broth to me. I've been a vegetarian my whole life, and I've never had a need to make bone broth. And so I started watching videos on it, and it's really interesting. You can take a really thick hunk of bone, put it in a crock pot for about 4 or 5 hours, and you don't even have to have it on particularly high heat, and that thing will turn to complete sponge. And if you keep going with it, that sponge becomes gelatinous, and so I think that is probably what's happened to the remainder of the body, is that it's just slowly being annihilated by whatever it is that turned the organs to stone. Livers, I'm finding. And then also, I think a lot of the stones that we find, I've talked about this in a number of the videos. If you think about things like kidney stones and gallstones, those can be in large numbers in the body. Like a single gallbladder can hold hundreds of gallstones. So my take is, if something is already stone at the time of petrification, then it's going to remain stone, and that could explain all of these little disc and oval shaped rocks, and potentially even things like geodes. These spherical stones that are crystalline in the center.
So they could be gallstones from Titans, you mean?
No, I'm thinking smaller bodies, but it's not just Titans or regular bodies. You've also got all the different sizes of giants to include, because giants are very much a real part of history. A lot of information has been squirreled away by organizations, probably like the Smithsonian, among others. We're fed all these stories that giants is just a fun fairy tale story. I don't believe that for a second. The amount of evidence in favor of giants is massive, and then especially when you factor in the architectural component of that.
We have to take a one and only break. Let me just say this before we take the break. And when we come back, I'm going to discuss the Smithsonian. I've been to many, many natural history museums around the world, and of course, there's always a preponderance of dinosaurs. History books are plagued by them, but there's absolutely nothing about giants. You are obviously, Mike, experiencing synchronicities, seeing petrified hearts in places you didn't expect, like a church or a restaurant. And also, the big question in my mind is, what caused the petrification and when? I know you don't discuss this that much because you just want to know what is there. Was it a natural event, or was it technology that was used to wipe out all the remnants of these beings before the realm was repopulated with a new size of beings, literally the size of ants in comparison to what used to be here, like in the movie Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. The creation of fossils also in such a short period of time with the right conditions. All of this and much more when we return. How can people learn more about your work, Mike? And also, if you want to mention the book that's coming up soon, which we'll have you back to discuss.
Well, the channel is the best way to find the research, because that's the only place I put it, which is Stellium7, Stellium, as in Mike, and then the number 7 without a space. That's the YouTube channel. There's lots of videos on there. Go to the playlists and you can see how it's been sorted out. And I have a mailing list for people who are interested in the book. It's on MailerLite. I'll provide you with a link that you can give in the show notes if people want to sign up. The book is hopefully going to be out in the next couple months. I was shooting for December for Christmas, but it's not going to happen in time. The book is called The Hacker Prince, A True Story, and it's about the stuff we talked about at the beginning of this episode.
Excellent. Well, folks, we have one more hour with Mike Wilkerson. This is Mel Hostelrick, and you are listening to Veritas. Don't go anywhere.
Thank you for listening to the first part of this important Veritas interview. To listen to the rest and all of our material, proceed to the members section or join the Veritas family by subscribing. Click on the subscribe button at veritasradio.com. Subscribe today. Don't forget to visit the Veritas store for Focus Life Force Energy. Get a 15-day free trial of FLFE today. We also have rebounders, pure organic sulfur, flash drives with all our Veritas and Sanitas seasons, and other great products. And if you want to get in touch with Mel, want to be a guest on this radio program, have a guest suggestion, or have feedback, just click on the contact button of our website at veritasradio.com. And if you're listening on YouTube, like, subscribe, and share the video. Click on the notification button to be alerted when new interviews are available. Now proceed to the member section or subscribe to listen to the rest of the interview. You don't want to miss it. Thank you for listening to Veritas. Because you don't want to believe, you want to know.